All right, everyone. So with module two, after reading some of the articles, one of the themes that I think, at least for me, has played out was this idea of normalization and how do we normalize like some of these oppressive actions that take place on students of color, specifically like brown and black students. Um, so I was curious to see like what kind of connections that we've all seen tying into oppression and normalizing that for our white students.
So I will start in the book Push Out. We talked about the criminalization of Black girls in schools. And when they were talking about normalizing oppression, they really talked about how basically Black girls in schools are kind of given two choices. They can either go with the status quo, they can go with like what the white students do, or they can be pushed to the side and then all of a sudden they start getting those labels of like disrespectful, rude. And basically by sitting there and by being able to so quickly split a group of students from such a young age, then you're pushing students into a point where some of these girls then it said that when one of the from the beginning, it said that a biggest trait or connection in a lot of girls that were at detention centers was that they had no meaningful connection with the school. And when that starts at such a young age of either you act, good or you're out, then it kind of just pushes through to so many other factors.
That feels relevant to the point that I was making about like where when students see themselves going through this and see people like them, their peers, constantly interacting with disciplinary measures and being policed and being under surveillance, it normalizes those practices and is prep for then being engaged constantly with a carceral state. And so existing in that state of oppression feels normal because it's what we're constantly putting upon these children from the time that they're in preschool. We're kicking preschoolers out of school. And I thought the connection that Lustig makes to Foucault and the panopticon and students constantly being under surveillance was an interesting and kind of poignant thing there, that we're always watching for any misstep.
Yeah, and I think like in my reading with the like Gregory et al. Article, like it even starts like within the inputs, like we're getting into this environment. So the students who are coming from poverty could be our students who are students of color. And so like when they're dealing with poverty, like they may come into the school with heightened anxiety and suffering from hypervigilance, irritability, and stress. And so if they come into school with these actions and stuff, the teachers are targeting them and in front of all our students, essentially kicking them out, disciplining them, making it almost normal for these actions to be seen at a level in our schools, and then or rationalizing it to put them into like special education classes because they can't handle their anxiety or they're diagnosed with X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and that reminds me of The Sound of Exclusion, because they were talking about how, education buildings are still very much white spaces. And so there's certain cultures and languages that have been normalized. And so when students of color enter these buildings, often they're talking about how they experience a lot of challenges with that. And one of them is when their language and culture isn't acknowledged or celebrated. Students can experience linguistic insecurity, which results in low academic achievement, anxiety, low self-esteem, and things of that nature.
And going back to Zach's point about students coming in from adverse backgrounds and things like that, most of the time when scientists examine the intelligence of African American students, they were 3 times as likely to diagnose an African American student with emotional issues or cognitive issues, and it didn't even take into account the backgrounds that they may have come from. And in the Anima article, another interesting point was how disability, we've given it this concrete, we've come to define it in this very concrete way, but what the article talks about is that it's ever changing, meaning that today what could be considered a disability might not even be one in 5 years, 15 years, 50 years, 100 years. So that term disability is ever changing. Another interesting part that I really kind of liked was it talks about sports. And in sports, persons with disabilities are put in their own categories, like the Special Olympics or what have you, and they're set apart to level the playing field. But then when you have someone that gets something like a prosthetic leg, that's seen as an unfair advantage. So they're either not adequate enough to compete normally, or they're too enhanced to compete, meaning that they're never going to be accepted as normal. So they're stigmatized.
And I think like overall, it seems like our themes are touching into like how does this play into like teacher bias and how they interact with our students, can demonstrate or perform these oppressive actions to be normal in our school systems, in our community, and what does that look like down the line when they're outside of school? How is this normalized in our society? Thanks everyone for sharing.